Somewhere in the mountains of northern Spain, approximately 40,000 years ago, a fire burned inside a limestone cave. The flames cast long shadows against walls that had sheltered generations of a people who had called this land home for over 300,000 years. Outside, snow fell silently across a landscape of pine forests and open grasslands, where mammoths and woolly rhinoceros moved through the twilight. The individual who tended this fire possessed a brain slightly larger than any human alive today. Their hands, powerful and precise, had crafted tools from stone with a skill refined across countless generations. They belonged to a species that had survived ice ages, hunted cave bears, cared for their sick and elderly, and buried their dead with what appears to be genuine reverence. Yet, within the span of perhaps 10,000 years, roughly 400 generations, their kind would vanish entirely from the face of the earth. This is the story of the Neanderthals' final chapter, a tale that spans the last 10 millennia of their existence. It is a story of encounter and coexistence, of two human species sharing the same landscapes during one of the most dramatic periods in our planet's recent history. It is also a story of gradual disappearance, a slow fading that left behind only bones, tools, and fragments of genetic code that still flow through the veins of billions of people alive today. The ending of their story is not marked by a single catastrophic event or a dramatic final battle. Instead, it unfolds quietly across thousands of years, in hundreds of valleys and countless individual lives, until one day the last of their kind drew their final breath in some forgotten corner of Ice Age Europe. To understand how the Neanderthals disappeared, we must first understand who they were during those final millennia. By 50,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had achieved a level of adaptation to European environments that remains impressive even by modern standards. Their bodies had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in the cold, fluctuating climates of Pleistocene Europe. They were shorter and more robust than modern humans, with barrel-shaped chests that housed larger lungs capable of efficiently processing the thin, cold air of glacial landscapes. Their limbs were proportionally shorter, reducing surface area and minimizing heat loss in environments where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The Neanderthal face itself told a story of adaptation. Their prominent brow ridges, once dismissed as primitive features, actually provided structural support for powerful jaw muscles capable of generating tremendous bite force. Their large noses, far from being merely cosmetic differences, served as sophisticated warming and humidifying chambers that conditioned frigid air before it reached vulnerable lung tissue. These were not primitive characteristics but rather elegant solutions to the profound challenges of surviving in Ice Age Europe. Their brains, averaging approximately 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to the modern human average of around 1,350, processed information in ways we are only beginning to understand. For decades, researchers assumed that Neanderthal intelligence must have been inferior to our own, that their eventual replacement by modern humans proved some fundamental cognitive deficiency. Yet the archaeological evidence accumulated over the past 50 years has steadily dismantled this assumption, revealing a species capable of sophisticated thought, planning, and symbolic behavior that would have seemed impossible to scientists just a generation ago. At sites across Europe, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the shores of the Black Sea, Neanderthals left behind evidence of their technological capabilities. At Abric Romani in Catalonia, excavations have revealed wooden tools preserved in exceptional conditions, including pointed implements that appear to have been fire-hardened for increased durability. The craftsmanship evident in these objects required planning, patience, and intimate knowledge of wood properties that could only be acquired through generations of accumulated knowledge passed from elders to youth. Their stone tool technology, known as the Mousterian industry after the site of Le Moustier in France, demonstrated remarkable sophistication. Neanderthals employed a technique called the Levallois method, which required the napper to visualize the final tool form before beginning work, carefully preparing a stone core through a series of precise strikes that would ultimately yield a single, predetermined flake. This process demanded what cognitive scientists call mental template matching, the ability to hold an abstract concept in mind while manipulating physical materials to achieve that concept. The consistency of Levallois products across vast geographic distances and tens of thousands of years suggests that Neanderthals possessed robust cultural transmission mechanisms capable of preserving and sharing complex technical knowledge. The social world of late Neanderthals appears to have been centered around extended family groups. Genetic analysis of remains from sites like El Sidron in Spain has revealed that Neanderthal communities were relatively small, perhaps numbering between 10 and 30 individuals, with females typically moving between groups while males remained with their birth communities. This pattern, known as patrilocality, is also common among modern human hunter-gatherer societies and suggests sophisticated social organization with established rules governing kinship and residence. Evidence for Neanderthal compassion and social bonds comes from numerous archaeological contexts. At Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, excavations uncovered the remains of an individual known as Shanidar I, a male who had survived into his 40s despite suffering severe injuries earlier in life. His right arm had been amputated above the elbow, likely due to trauma, and he showed signs of a crushing injury to the left side of his face that would have left him partially blind. The healing evident in his bones proves that he survived these catastrophic injuries for years, perhaps decades. He could not have done so alone. Someone fed him, protected him, and cared for him when he could not care for himself. Similar evidence appears at La Chapelle aux Saints in France, where an elderly Neanderthal male was deliberately buried in a pit with his head resting on a stone. His skeleton shows advanced arthritis that would have made movement painful and hunting impossible. Like Shanidar I, he survived through the care of others who valued his life even when he could no longer contribute to the group's immediate survival. These were not isolated incidents, but rather expressions of what appears to be a consistent pattern of Neanderthal social behavior, a recognition that individuals had worth beyond their immediate utility. The question of Neanderthal symbolic thought has generated intense debate among researchers, with new discoveries continually reshaping our understanding. At Berniquel Cave in southwestern France, researchers discovered a structure built from broken stalagmites arranged in circular patterns deep within the cave system, approximately 330 meters from the entrance. Uranium-thorium dating placed the construction at approximately 176,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans reached Europe. The effort required to build these structures in complete darkness, carrying fire and materials deep into the earth, suggests purpose beyond mere practicality. Whether that purpose was ceremonial, spiritual, or something entirely beyond our comprehension remains unknown, but it demonstrates cognitive capabilities that challenge simplistic narratives of Neanderthal primitiveness. More recent discoveries have further complicated the picture. At Cueva de los Avions in southeastern Spain, researchers found perforated shells that had been collected, transported, and apparently worn as personal ornaments by Neanderthals approximately 115,000 years ago. Some shells contained residues of pigments, suggesting they may have been painted or used as containers for colored materials. Similar finds at other Iberian sites suggest that symbolic behavior among Neanderthals was not a late development influenced by contact with modern humans, but rather an indigenous tradition stretching back deep into their evolutionary history. The world that Neanderthals inhabited during their final millennia was one of profound environmental instability. The period between 60,000 and 30,000 years ago witnessed dramatic climate fluctuations that repeatedly transformed European landscapes. During cold phases, glaciers advanced southward from Scandinavia, covering much of northern Europe under ice sheets that could reach thicknesses exceeding 2 kilometers. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters as water became locked in continental ice, exposing vast areas of continental shelf and creating land bridges that connected Britain to continental Europe and allowed travel across what is now the English Channel. During these glacial periods, much of Europe became a treeless steppe dominated by cold-adapted grasses, sedges, and herbs. The Mammoth steppe, as this ecosystem is known, supported enormous populations of large herbivores including woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, horses, bison, and reindeer. These animals provided Neanderthals with not only meat and fat, but also bone for tools, sinew for binding, and hides for clothing and shelter. The density and predictability of these animal populations during certain seasons would have created opportunities for successful hunting even by small groups using relatively simple coordination strategies. Between glacial advances, warmer interglacial periods allowed forests to reclaim much of Europe. Oak, beech, and other deciduous species spread northward from refugia in southern Europe, transforming open landscapes into dense woodlands that supported different animal communities. Forest-adapted species like deer, wild boar, and aurochs replaced the cold-adapted megafauna of the open steppe. These environmental shifts required Neanderthals to adjust their hunting strategies, tool technologies, and settlement patterns repeatedly throughout their history. The Neanderthals' success in surviving these fluctuations for over 300,000 years demonstrates remarkable adaptive flexibility. They occupied territories ranging from the Mediterranean coast, where winter temperatures remained relatively mild, to the edges of the northern ice sheets, where survival required sophisticated cold weather adaptations. Evidence from isotopic analysis of Neanderthal bones suggests that their diets varied substantially depending on local conditions, with some populations relying heavily on large herbivores while others incorporated significant amounts of plant foods, small game, and even marine resources. The story of Neanderthal disappearance cannot be told without understanding the arrival of another human species in Europe. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, had evolved in Africa by approximately 300,000 years ago and had begun expanding beyond their ancestral continent in multiple waves over the following millennia. The most significant of these expansions for the Neanderthal story began somewhere between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago, when groups of modern humans began moving through the Levant and into the territories that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. The earliest confirmed presence of modern humans in Europe comes from sites dating to approximately 45,000 years ago. At Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria, archaeologists have recovered human remains and associated artifacts dating to this period, representing some of the oldest direct evidence for our species on the continent. Similar ages have been obtained from sites in Italy, Romania, and elsewhere, suggesting that modern humans entered Europe through multiple routes and established themselves across a broad geographic front within a relatively short period. The modern humans who arrived in Europe were not mere refugees fleeing African conditions, but rather members of populations that had already demonstrated remarkable adaptive capabilities during their expansion across Asia. They carried with them technological traditions that differed in subtle but potentially significant ways from Neanderthal practices. Their stone tools, initially grouped under the term Upper Paleolithic industries, included a greater emphasis on blade production, the systematic creation of long, narrow flakes that could be produced in greater quantities from a given amount of raw material than the flakes produced by Mousterian techniques. These newcomers also brought traditions of working bone, antler, and ivory into tools and ornaments on a scale that exceeded anything in the Neanderthal archaeological record. At sites throughout Europe dating to the period after modern human arrival, excavations have recovered an explosion of worked organic materials, including needles with eyes for sewing-fitted clothing, otlotl hooks for propelling spears with greater force and accuracy, and elaborately decorated objects that appear to have served primarily symbolic or social functions. The encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans unfolded gradually across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. This was not a sudden collision between two opposing armies, but rather a slow intermingling of populations that proceeded at different rates in different regions. In some areas, the two species may have coexisted for thousands of years, occupying the same broad landscapes while perhaps utilizing different ecological niches or seasonal territories. In other areas, replacement may have occurred more rapidly, with modern human populations expanding into territories that Neanderthals had recently abandoned due to climate fluctuations or other pressures. The nature of interactions between these two human species remains one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. For much of the 20th century, researchers assumed that the encounter must have been primarily hostile, that modern humans either exterminated Neanderthals through direct violence or outcompete them so thoroughly that extinction was inevitable. More recent evidence has complicated this picture considerably. The most significant revelation has come from genetic analysis of both ancient Neanderthal DNA and the genomes of living humans. In 2010, researchers announced that they had successfully sequenced a significant portion of the Neanderthal genome using DNA extracted from bones found at Vindija Cave in Croatia. The results were startling. Comparison with modern human genomes revealed clear evidence that Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred, and that people of non-African ancestry carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This genetic legacy proves that at least some encounters between the two species were not hostile, but intimate. Children were born from unions between Neanderthals and modern humans, and at least some of those children survived to reproduce themselves, passing Neanderthal genetic material into lineages that continue to this day. Subsequent research has revealed additional complexity in this genetic picture. Some Neanderthal DNA segments appear to have been positively selected in human populations, meaning they conferred survival or reproductive advantages that caused them to increase in frequency over thousands of generations. These beneficial sequences include variants affecting immune function, skin and hair characteristics, and other traits that may have helped modern human populations adapt to European environments that Neanderthals had already mastered. In a sense, interbreeding with Neanderthals may have accelerated modern human adaptation to Ice Age Europe by introducing genetic variants that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection in that specific environment. The archaeological record of the period between 45,000 and 30,000 years ago reveals a complex mosaic of cultural interactions and transitions. At some sites, distinctly Neanderthal and distinctly modern human artifact assemblages appear in separate stratigraphic layers, suggesting alternating occupation by the two species with little direct contact. At other sites, the picture is far more complicated, with assemblages that combine elements from both traditions or that cannot be clearly attributed to either species. The Châtelperronian industry, found at sites across France and northern Spain dating to approximately 42,000 to 36,000 years ago, exemplifies this complexity. Châtelperronian assemblages include blade tools and personal ornaments typically associated with modern humans. Yet at several sites these artifacts have been found in association with Neanderthal skeletal remains. The interpretation of this pattern remains contentious. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals independently developed these technologies, demonstrating cognitive capabilities equivalent to those of modern humans. Others suggest that Neanderthals adopted these innovations through contact with modern human populations, either through direct interaction or by observing and imitating their new neighbors. A third possibility holds that the associations are misleading, resulting from mixing of deposits or other taphonomic processes that have created artificial connections between unrelated materials. At Grotte du Renne in France, excavations have recovered both Châtelperronian artifacts and Neanderthal remains, including teeth from multiple individuals. The ornaments found at this site include pierced animal teeth and bones that would have been worn as pendants or attached to clothing. If these objects were indeed made and worn by Neanderthals, they represent clear evidence for symbolic behavior and personal ornamentation within this species. The debate over their interpretation continues, but the very existence of such ambiguous assemblages speaks to the complexity of the transition period and the inadequacy of simple replacement models. As the millennia passed, Neanderthal populations contracted toward refugia in southern Europe. The process was neither sudden nor uniform but rather proceeded gradually, with Neanderthals persisting longer in some regions than others. Climate fluctuations played a significant role, with cold periods that pushed both species southward and warm periods that allowed northward expansion. During these fluctuations, the geographic ranges of Neanderthals and modern humans would have overlapped more or less extensively, creating varying opportunities for interaction, competition, and interbreeding. By approximately 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had largely disappeared from Central and Eastern Europe. The latest reliable dates for Neanderthal presence in these regions cluster around this time, with subsequent archaeological deposits dominated by distinctly modern human artifacts. The transition appears to have occurred relatively rapidly once it began, suggesting that whatever factors drove Neanderthal decline operated efficiently once they reached a critical threshold. Southern Europe, particularly the Iberian Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula, became the last strongholds of Neanderthal populations. The mountainous terrain of these regions may have provided refugia where Neanderthal populations could persist even as modern humans dominated surrounding areas. The relatively mild Mediterranean climate would have reduced the energetic demands of survival, potentially allowing smaller populations to maintain themselves on reduced resource bases. Geographic barriers like the Pyrenees and the Alps may have slowed the southward expansion of modern human populations, buying Neanderthals additional time in these peripheral regions. The evidence from Iberia tells the most detailed story of Neanderthal persistence and ultimate disappearance. Sites across Spain and Portugal have yielded Neanderthal remains and artifacts dating to periods when the species had already vanished from most of Europe. At Gorham's cave on the British territory of Gibraltar, excavations have recovered evidence of Neanderthal occupation dating to approximately 32,000 years ago, making this one of the latest confirmed Neanderthal sites anywhere in the world. Gorham's cave occupies a commanding position on the eastern face of the Rock of Gibraltar, overlooking what during the Ice Age would have been a broad coastal plain extending several kilometers toward the Mediterranean. The cave system extends deep into the limestone, providing shelter from both summer heat and winter storms. Its position near sea level would have offered access to marine resources including shellfish, fish, and sea mammals, supplementing the terrestrial game available in the surrounding landscape. The Neanderthal occupants of Gorham's cave left behind an archaeological record that speaks to their capabilities and their world. Stone tools manufactured using traditional Mousterian techniques appear throughout the deposits, demonstrating continuity with Neanderthal technological traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years. Animal bones recovered from the site indicate a broad diet including red deer, ibex, rabbits, and various marine species. The exploitation of such diverse resources suggests flexible subsistence strategies capable of responding to seasonal and annual variations in food availability. Perhaps most intriguingly, the walls of Gorham's cave bear what may be deliberate engravings created by Neanderthal hands. A crosshatched pattern carved into the rock surface has been dated to at least 39,000 years ago based on the age of deposits covering it. Microscopic analysis of the grooves suggests they were created by repeated strokes with a stone tool, ruling out natural processes or accidental marking. If this interpretation is correct, the Gorham's cave engravings represent evidence for abstract or symbolic thought among some of the last Neanderthals on Earth. The final disappearance of Neanderthals occurred sometime between approximately 35,000 and 30,000 years ago. Pinning down the precise date is challenging because radiocarbon dating becomes increasingly imprecise for samples older than about 30,000 years, and because the latest Neanderthal sites are few in number and often lack the organic materials necessary for reliable dating. What we can say with confidence is that by 30,000 years ago, Neanderthals had vanished entirely, leaving behind only their bones, their tools, and the genetic legacy carried by their hybrid descendants. The causes of Neanderthal extinction have been debated for over a century, with proposed explanations ranging from climate change to disease to violent extermination by modern humans. No single factor provides a fully satisfying explanation, and most researchers now favor models that incorporate multiple interacting causes operating over thousands of years. Climate change certainly played a role in Neanderthal decline. The period between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago witnessed particularly severe climate instability, with rapid oscillations between cold and warm conditions that would have repeatedly disrupted ecosystems and the animal populations that both human species depended upon. These Heinrich events, as the coldest episodes are known, saw massive discharges of icebergs into the North Atlantic that disrupted ocean circulation and triggered abrupt cooling across Europe. During the worst of these events, Neanderthal populations would have been forced to retreat southward, contracting into smaller areas with reduced carrying capacity. Yet Neanderthals had survived climate fluctuations before, including periods of comparable or even greater severity. What made the late Pleistocene different was the presence of a competitor who was also affected by climate stress but who may have possessed advantages that became decisive under conditions of resource scarcity. If modern humans were even slightly more efficient at extracting resources from the environment, or slightly more successful at surviving and reproducing under marginal conditions, these small differences could have compounded over centuries and millennia to produce dramatically different outcomes for the two species. Demographic factors may have been particularly important in determining the ultimate fate of Neanderthals. Computer simulations of population dynamics suggest that even small differences in birth rates, death rates, or age at first reproduction could have led to modern human population growth while Neanderthal populations declined, even without any direct competition between the two species. If modern human females began reproducing slightly earlier, or if modern human infants had slightly higher survival rates, these advantages would have accumulated over generations to produce population trajectories that inevitably led to Neanderthal replacement. The relatively small size of Neanderthal social groups may have contributed to their vulnerability. Genetic evidence suggests that Neanderthal populations were characterized by low genetic diversity and high levels of inbreeding, consistent with small, isolated groups that rarely mixed with distant populations. Such demographic structure would have made Neanderthal populations particularly susceptible to random fluctuations in birth and death rates, local extinctions from which recovery might have been difficult or impossible, and loss of genetic diversity that could have reduced adaptive potential over time. Modern human populations, by contrast, appear to have maintained larger social networks that connected groups across greater distances. Evidence for long-distance transport of raw materials and stylistic similarities in artifacts across broad geographic areas suggests that modern human groups maintained connections that allowed for gene flow, information exchange, and demographic rescue when local populations faced difficulties. These expanded networks may have provided a buffer against the kinds of random fluctuations that could have been fatal to smaller, more isolated Neanderthal groups. The role of technology in Neanderthal extinction remains controversial but cannot be ignored entirely. Modern humans arriving in Europe brought with them technological traditions that differed from Neanderthal practices in ways that may have conferred competitive advantages under certain conditions. The greater emphasis on blade production in Upper Paleolithic industries may have allowed more efficient use of high-quality raw materials, which were often available only from specific geological sources that might be located far from hunting territories. The development of sophisticated projectile weapons, including spear throwers that increase the range and force of thrown weapons, may have allowed modern human hunters to take game with lower risk of injury from wounded prey. The invention of the eyed needle, which appears in the archaeological record shortly after modern human arrival in Europe, suggests the development of tailored clothing that would have provided superior protection against cold compared to the wrapped hides that Neanderthals apparently used. In environments where winter temperatures regularly dropped far below freezing, even small improvements in cold weather gear could have translated into meaningful survival advantages. Groups that could keep their members warmer would have lost fewer individuals to hypothermia and cold-related illness, compounding over generations into significant demographic differences. Yet it is important not to overstate the technological gap between the two species. Neanderthals were not primitive beings struggling with stone tools while modern humans wielded sophisticated technologies. Both species were skilled tool makers who had adapted their technologies to local conditions over thousands of generations. The differences between them were matters of degree rather than kind. Subtle variations in emphasis and technique that may have mattered greatly under conditions of resource stress, but that would have been barely noticeable during periods of abundance. Disease has been proposed as another factor in Neanderthal extinction, though direct evidence remains elusive. Modern humans expanding out of Africa would have carried pathogens to which they had developed some degree of immunity, but which might have been devastating to Neanderthal populations encountering them for the first time. Historical parallels exist in the catastrophic epidemics that swept through Native American populations following European contact, caused by diseases like smallpox and measles to which indigenous peoples had no prior exposure. The plausibility of disease-driven extinction depends partly on the nature and frequency of contact between the two species. If interactions were common and intimate, as suggested by genetic evidence for interbreeding, then disease transmission would have been likely. Pathogens adapted to human hosts could have spread through Neanderthal populations with devastating effect, potentially causing population crashes from which recovery might have been impossible. Even relatively mild diseases that modern humans could survive might have proven fatal to Neanderthals whose immune systems had no experience with these specific pathogens. However, the archaeological record provides no direct evidence for epidemic disease among late Neanderthal populations. Skeletal remains from this period do not show the kinds of lesions or other indicators that might suggest widespread infectious disease, though such evidence would be difficult to detect even if it existed. The disease hypothesis remains plausible but unproven, one of several factors that may have contributed to Neanderthal decline without being solely responsible for their extinction. Perhaps the most profound shift in how we understand Neanderthal extinction involves recognizing that it was not a simple replacement but rather a partial absorption. The genetic evidence for interbreeding means that Neanderthals did not simply disappear but rather contributed their genes to the expanding modern human populations that eventually dominated Europe. In this sense, Neanderthals did not go entirely extinct but rather merged, incompletely and asymmetrically, with the populations that replaced them. The Neanderthal DNA carried by billions of people alive today is not uniformly distributed across the genome but rather concentrated in specific regions that appear to have been favored by natural selection. These include genes affecting keratin, the protein that forms hair and skin, suggesting that Neanderthal variants may have helped modern humans adapt to the different light conditions of Europe compared to Africa. Other Neanderthal variants affect immune function, potentially providing resistance to pathogens that Neanderthals had encountered during their long residence in Europe. Not all Neanderthal DNA was beneficial, however. Certain genomic regions show consistent depletion of Neanderthal ancestry across modern human populations, suggesting that some Neanderthal variants were actively selected against over thousands of generations. Particularly notable is the near-complete absence of Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome and in regions affecting male fertility. This pattern suggests that hybrid males may have suffered reduced fertility, a common outcome when closely related but distinct species interbreed. The persistence of Neanderthal DNA in other genomic regions despite apparent selection against hybrids indicates that the advantages conferred by some Neanderthal variants outweighed the costs of harboring this foreign genetic material. The individual Neanderthals who lived through the final millennia of their species' existence could not have known that they were part of a declining population destined for extinction. Their lives unfolded according to the same rhythms that had governed their ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. They woke each morning to the same challenges of finding food, avoiding predators, caring for children, and maintaining the social bonds that made survival possible. They experienced joy and grief, formed attachments to places and people, and passed their days in activities that seemed to them as permanent and natural as the mountains and rivers that surrounded them. At some sites, we can glimpse something of these individual lives through the objects they left behind and the marks they made on the world. At El Sidron in northern Spain, genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains has allowed researchers to reconstruct family relationships among individuals who died there approximately 49,000 years ago. The group included 3 adult males who were closely related, likely brothers or father and sons, along with 3 adult females and several children. The females came from different genetic lineages than the males, consistent with a pattern where females moved between groups while males remained with their birth communities. The El Sidron individuals met a violent end. Their bones show clear evidence of cannibalism, with cut marks indicating flesh removal and fractures consistent with marrow extraction. Whether this cannibalism was ritual, survival-driven, or evidence of violence between groups remains unknown. What is clear is that these individuals, who had lived together and perhaps loved one another, ended their lives together in circumstances that speak to the harshness and precariousness of Neanderthal existence. The final Neanderthals lived in a world where their kind were increasingly rare. The territories that had once sustained robust populations now held only scattered groups, separated by vast distances and perhaps unaware of one another's existence. The social networks that had connected Neanderthal communities across Europe had collapsed, leaving isolated populations without access to potential mates from outside their immediate groups. The genetic consequences of this isolation would have been severe, with inbreeding depression reducing fitness and limiting the adaptive potential of remaining populations. In their final refugia in southern Iberia, the last Neanderthals may have persisted for thousands of years after the species had vanished from the rest of Europe. The mild climate and diverse resources of this region would have provided relatively favorable conditions for survival, even as populations dwindled and social structures deteriorated. Groups that had once consisted of dozens of individuals may have shrunk to mere handfuls, struggling to maintain the cultural knowledge and cooperative behaviors that had sustained their ancestors. The very last Neanderthals may have lived their entire lives without ever encountering another of their kind outside their immediate family group. They would have had no concept of species or extinction, no understanding that they represented the final chapter of a lineage stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. They simply lived their lives according to the traditions they had inherited, doing what their parents and grandparents had done, unaware that there would be no one to continue after them. The site of Gorham's cave on Gibraltar may have witnessed some of these final days. the rock promontory, visible from great distances across the surrounding sea and plain, would have been a landmark known to Neanderthals for countless generations. The cave itself offered shelter, access to diverse resources, and perhaps connections to the ancestors who had lived and died there over tens of thousands of years. For the last Neanderthals who may have called this place home, it represented everything they knew of the world. The archaeological deposits at Gorham's cave thin toward the top of the sequence, suggesting reduced intensity of occupation as Neanderthal populations declined. The stone tools from the latest levels show no evidence of technological innovation or contact with modern human traditions, only continuity with practices that had served Neanderthals for millennia. The occupants of this final phase were not desperate survivors adopting new strategies, but rather people carrying on as they always had, perhaps unaware that their way of life was ending. At some point, the fires in Gorham's cave went out for the last time. The final Neanderthal who had warmed themselves there, who had perhaps looked out over the moonlit sea while contemplating whatever thoughts moved through their powerful brain, was gone. The cave fell silent except for the sound of wind and waves, the drip of water forming new mineral deposits on the walls. The bones and tools left behind would lie undisturbed for 30,000 years, waiting to be discovered by descendants of the species that had survived. The extinction of Neanderthals raises questions that extend beyond the purely scientific into realms of philosophy and ethics. Were modern humans responsible for the disappearance of their closest relatives? If so, does this constitute a kind of primordial crime, the first genocide in human history? Or was the outcome of the encounter between these two species simply a natural consequence of evolutionary processes, no more morally significant than the extinction of dinosaurs or trilobites? The archaeological evidence does not support scenarios of deliberate extermination. There are no mass graves, no evidence of systematic violence targeting Neanderthals as a group, no signs of the organized warfare that would have been necessary to hunt down and eliminate a species spread across an entire continent. If modern humans killed Neanderthals, they did so one individual at a time, in isolated encounters that would have been indistinguishable from the violence that likely occurred within both species as competing groups contested resources. Yet the absence of deliberate genocide does not necessarily absolve modern humans of responsibility. If our ancestors simply outcompete Neanderthals for resources, if they occupied territories that Neanderthals needed for survival, if they unknowingly spread diseases that devastated Neanderthal populations, the outcome was the same as if they had set out to destroy their rivals. The expansion of modern humans across Europe was not a benign process, but rather one that had profound consequences for other species, including the one that most closely resembled ourselves. The legacy of Neanderthals extends beyond the DNA they contributed to modern human populations. Their existence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what it means to be human, about the nature of intelligence and consciousness, about the relationship between biological difference and moral status. For most of human history since the discovery of Neanderthal remains, these questions could be avoided by depicting Neanderthals as primitive, subhuman creatures whose extinction was inevitable and perhaps even desirable. The accumulating evidence of Neanderthal cognitive and social complexity has made such comfortable dismissals increasingly untenable. If Neanderthals buried their dead, cared for their sick, created art, and developed sophisticated technologies, then they possessed at least some of the characteristics that we typically associate with personhood. Their extinction was not the disappearance of mere animals, but rather the loss of another way of being human, another experiment in intelligence and culture that the universe had produced and that will never be repeated. The story of Neanderthal extinction holds lessons for understanding our own species and our relationship with the rest of the natural world. The factors that drove Neanderthals to extinction, including climate change, habitat loss, competition with invasive species, and the fragmentation of populations into isolated groups, are the same factors that threaten countless species today. The difference is that we are now the agents of these changes rather than their victims. And we possess the capacity to understand what we are doing in a way that Neanderthals could not. The disappearance of Neanderthals also reminds us that evolutionary success is never permanent. For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals were superbly adapted to their environments, surviving challenges that would have eliminated lesser species. Yet, in the end, this long history of success did not protect them from extinction when circumstances changed in ways they could not adapt to quickly enough. Modern humans have existed for a far shorter time and have achieved dominance over the planet through technological rather than biological means. There is no guarantee that our species will prove more durable than our Neanderthal relatives. As we consider the Neanderthals' final chapter, we might pause to imagine that last individual. Whoever they were, perhaps it was an elderly woman, the last of her group, who had watched her children and grandchildren die one by one until she alone remained. Perhaps it was a young hunter who wandered alone across landscapes that had once teemed with others of his kind, searching for companions he would never find. Perhaps it was a child, too young to understand why there were no others, who fell asleep one night and did not wake. We will never know the circumstances of the last Neanderthal death, never be able to identify the individual who carried the final spark of their species' existence. Their bones lie somewhere, perhaps in a cave we have not yet discovered, perhaps eroded away or buried under meters of sediment. What we do know is that their lineage did not end entirely. In the DNA of billions of living humans, fragments of the Neanderthal genome persist, passed down through countless generations since those long-ago encounters when two human species met and sometimes became one. The children born from unions between Neanderthals and modern humans were bridges between two worlds. They carried within their cells the genetic heritage of both species, inheriting traits that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of separate development. Some of these children may have been raised among Neanderthals, learning their traditions and technologies while carrying modern human genes that would eventually disappear when their lineages ended. Others were raised among modern humans, their Neanderthal heritage gradually diluting over generations until it reached the 1 to 4% found in people today. These hybrid individuals were not anomalies or mistakes, but rather representatives of something that happened whenever the two species shared territories. The genetic evidence suggests that interbreeding occurred repeatedly across thousands of years and in multiple geographic regions. Each instance represented not just a biological event but a human one, an encounter between individuals who somehow bridged the differences between their kinds to create something new. The persistence of Neanderthal DNA in modern populations speaks to a kind of survival that transcends individual lives or even species boundaries. The Neanderthals who contributed this DNA could not have imagined that their genetic legacy would endure for tens of thousands of years, carried by populations vastly larger than any they had ever known. Yet here we are, carrying fragments of their genomes as we go about our lives in a world they would not recognize, in numbers they could not have conceived. The study of Neanderthals continues to yield surprises that reshape our understanding of who they were and how they lived. New dating techniques allow more precise determination of when specific events occurred, refining the timeline of Neanderthal decline and helping to identify potential causes. Ancient DNA technology grows more sophisticated each year, allowing researchers to extract genetic information from ever older and more degraded samples. These advances promise to answer questions that seemed permanently beyond reach just a generation ago. Future discoveries may reveal Neanderthal sites that push back the date of their final disappearance, extending the period of coexistence with modern humans or identifying refugia where they persisted longer than currently known. New analytical techniques may allow researchers to extract information from artifacts and remains that have already been collected, finding patterns and relationships that previous technologies could not detect. Each discovery adds detail to a picture that will never be complete, but that grows richer with each passing year. Yet there are limits to what science can reveal about the inner lives of people who left no written records and whose cultures vanished millennia before history began. We can reconstruct their technologies and their diets, map their migrations and measure their skulls, sequence their genomes and analyze the isotopes in their bones. But we cannot know what they thought about the stars, whether they laughed at the same things we find funny, what stories they told around their fires, or how they explained the world to their children. These unknowable aspects of Neanderthal existence may be the most important. The scientific facts tell us what Neanderthals did and how their bodies functioned, but they cannot capture the subjective experience of being a Neanderthal, of looking out at an Ice Age landscape through eyes very much like our own, processing that scene with a brain that was in many ways similar to ours yet also profoundly different. That experience existed, was real to those who lived it, and has vanished as completely as if it had never been. The extinction of Neanderthals thus represents not just the loss of a population or a species, but the loss of a unique way of experiencing and understanding the world. Whatever consciousness Neanderthals possessed, whatever it felt like to be one of them, that form of awareness no longer exists and can never be recreated. The universe has lost something that it once contained, and we are poorer for that loss even if we cannot fully grasp what has been lost. The final millennia of Neanderthal existence unfolded in a world that we would find both familiar and profoundly strange. The landscapes of Ice Age Europe bore some resemblance to places we know today. The same mountains and rivers, the same basic shapes of coastlines and continental outlines. Yet those landscapes were populated by creatures that have since vanished, covered by forests and grasslands that no longer exist, subject to climate fluctuations that dwarf anything in recorded human history. In that world, two human species shared the earth for thousands of years, sometimes in the same valleys and along the same rivers. They may have watched one another from distances, encountered one another at water sources and hunting grounds, competed for the same prey and the same sheltered places. Sometimes they came together in ways that produced children, creating family bonds that crossed the boundaries between species. More often, perhaps, they simply coexisted, each pursuing their own lives according to their own traditions, aware of the other without deeply understanding them. This period of coexistence ended not with a bang but with a whisper, a gradual fading as Neanderthal populations contracted and modern human populations grew. There was no final confrontation, no decisive moment when one species triumphed over the other. Instead, there was simply the slow accumulation of countless small differences in birth rates and death rates, in resource acquisition and disease resistance, in the ability to form connections across distances and respond to changing conditions. Over thousands of years, these small differences compounded into an unbridgeable gap, until one day the last Neanderthal was gone and only modern humans remained. If you have listened this far, you have followed the story of an entire people through their final chapter. You have traced their journey from the heights of their adaptation to the depths of their extinction, from caves warm with fire to silent empty places where their descendants would never return. You have encountered individuals who lived and loved and died tens of thousands of years ago, whose bones now rest in museum collections or still lie buried under layers of sediment accumulated since their passing. Perhaps the story has made you think differently about what it means to be human, about the fragility of success and the permanence of extinction. Perhaps you carry a bit of Neanderthal DNA yourself, a tangible connection to a people who otherwise exist only in bones and stones and the reconstructions we build from them. Perhaps, as sleep approaches, you will dream of Ice Age landscapes, of fires burning in limestone caves, of faces that are almost but not quite like our own. The Neanderthals are gone, but they are not entirely forgotten. In laboratories around the world, researchers continue to study their remains, seeking answers to questions that would have made no sense to the people who left those remains behind. The fires that once burned in Gorham's cave and 1,000 other places across Europe have long since gone cold. The people who tended those fires have been gone for 300 centuries. Their individual lives forgotten, their hopes and fears and daily struggles erased by time. Yet something of them remains, in the genetic legacy they passed to their hybrid children, in the tools and traces they left behind, in the questions they inspire us to ask about ourselves and our place in the world. The story of the last Neanderthals is, in the end, a story about endings, about how even the most successful adaptations eventually run their course, about how the future belongs to those who can claim it. It is a story without heroes or villains, only people doing their best to survive in a difficult world, some of whom succeeded and some of whom did not. It is a story that has no moral except perhaps this: that existence is precious, that every way of being human matters, and that what is lost can never fully be recovered. The night falls over Gibraltar, as it has fallen every night for 30,000 years since the last Neanderthals vanished from this place. The cave that once sheltered them stands empty now, visited only by researchers and tourists who come to see where another kind of human once lived. The Mediterranean stretches away to the south, the same sea that Neanderthal eyes once watched, though the coastline has changed and the world has transformed beyond recognition. Somewhere in the darkness, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear the echoes of voices that have been silent for 300 centuries. They speak in a language that no one remembers, about lives that no one will ever fully understand. They are the Neanderthals, our closest relatives, our sometime companions, our eternal mysteries. They are gone, but they were here, and for a time, they shared this world with us.